Hello, everyone, and welcome to our virtual event of T.C. Boyle's new book, Talk to Me. Before we begin, I'd like to remind folks that we have signed book plates available for those who purchase a copy of Talk to Me today. Just make sure to write signed book plate in the order comments when you're checking out your cart on our website, and you can access our website by clicking on the green purchase button directly below the viewer screen. Also, we will be doing an audience Q&A towards the end of the event. To submit your questions, just use the Ask a Question button at the very bottom of the screen. You can also vote for any questions you'd like, and the popular ones will make their way to the top of the list. All right, so with that said, I'm going to hand things over to our moderator, Mark, from our sister store, Book Soup. And enjoy the talk, everyone.
I'm really honored to be speaking with T.C. Boyle today, one of the master postmodernists of the late 20th and early 21st centuries. I was first introduced to his work by my middle school English teacher, one of those archetypal inspiring English teachers, shout out to Mr. B, who recommended The Tortilla Curtain after I became enamored with and wore through all my Vonnegut paperbacks. And I'll admit the Tortilla Curtain went a little over my head at 12 years old. Not quite as accessible as Vonnegut, but a great wreck full of the same biting brilliance as Vonnegut nonetheless. It was in college that I rediscovered Boyle through stories like Greasy Lake and After the Plague, creative writing workshops, quickly catapulting him to the top of my list of favorite contemporary American male writers, alongside people like Barthelme, DFW, and John Barth. So when I saw the Vroman's newsletter asking if any booksellers were fans and interested in being in conversation with them, I jumped at this opportunity. Special thanks to Vroman's for hosting this event in honor of Boyle's excellent new novel, Talk to Me. The book follows an interspecies love triangle set during the late 70s sign language experiments with chimps, reminiscent of the chimps Coco and Nim in the work of primatologists like Jane Goodall and Elizabeth Hess. In typical Boylean fashion, he asks thought-provoking questions about the consciousness of animals, other minds, communication, what makes us human, all while weaving together an intricate, entertaining farce. Mr. Boyle has published 17 novels and 12 collections of short stories. He won the PEN Faulkner Award in 1988 for his third novel, World's End. And I'm going to mispronounce this, but the Prix Médecine Étranger.
Étranger.
Thank you. Much better French than me. For The Tortilla Curtain in 1995. And most recently, he's been the recipient of the Mark Twain Voice in American Literature Award, the Henry David Thoreau Award, and the Jonathan Swift Prize for Satire. Without further ado, I'm delighted to introduce Mr. T.C. Boyle.
Hi, Mark. Thanks for that great intro. What I loved best was your story about your teacher in middle school. I had the same experience, and it was Donald Grant, our English teacher, who was an amateur actor. And on Fridays, if we were good, and we were pretty good, he would read us aloud, perform for us a story, the old chestnuts, from the good old days. And I would go out of that class with my hair standing on end. And I attribute to him not only partially my love of literature, but also my love of performance. We have this wonderful format, which is great because I don't have to change out of, I don't even have to put any pants on, which I haven't done today. But I love to perform live and to be an actor. And I think he was the one who made me realize that was a possibility.
Well, and so much of literature goes back to the oral tradition too. I know you have a section, an excerpt that you would like to read to us. Did you want to start off with that?
Well, I think we should talk for a few minutes first, Mark, and work our way up to it.
Sure, yeah.
And set it in its place. How's that?
Okay. Well, actually, I have the perfect question, I think, to set up because what I find most striking and the most striking and effective choice of your new novel, Talk to Me, is the choice to tell some of the story through the point of view of Sam, the chimp. I'm interested in how you arrived at this decision and what its implications are for some of the themes of the book.
Well, what attracted me most to this was the question of whether or not I could enter the consciousness of another species, a creature of another species. We do this regularly when we're entering the consciousness of some other human being. And I've written, of course, from every perspective of every possible person on this earth. And I felt it would be a real challenge. And it turned out to be the most fun that I've had in a book in a long time, narrating from Sam's point of view. And of course, it is a trick, but all narration is a trick in novels. You know, you have to suspend your disbelief. You have to believe that these are real characters and they're really thinking these thoughts and saying these things. And so it wasn't that great a leap. However, I am the narrator, as in any novel, there is an author standing behind it narrating, however seamless the narrative may be. And in this case, you'll see in the little excerpt that I'll read to you that the narrator is standing back and giving a very close third person point of view of Sam, but yet talking to you, the reader, to assure you that this is just another character and there are things beyond his ken. So that said, now maybe I should read. Let me set this up a little bit. What this book is about is the experiments, as Mark said, of trying to teach chimps our language. It was very exciting back in the 1970s to think that perhaps we could communicate with another species on a deeper level than we communicate with our dogs, which is pretty deep nonetheless. But the hope was that dolphins, chimps, gorillas could reveal something to us in our language about the mystery of this life on this planet, who we are, what we're doing here, what it means. And that didn't happen. That didn't happen, and the experiments kind of lost steam. I mean, they're still going on, and they're still valuable and wonderful. All these experiments into animal consciousness, whether it be in the crow, which is the smartest bird there is, or with primates, it's all been great. So I've set this story in a time period where this was still very exciting and very much in the forefront of psychology at the time and animal behavior. Sam is cross-fostered, as in Nim Chimpsky, by the way, where I get much of the information from, the great book which you mentioned earlier. That means that he doesn't understand that he's of another species. He is raised entirely from birth in a human household with parents and associates. And the idea was to see how language acquisition occurs. And of course, it does occur in the household. Long before we arrive at school, we know how to talk already. In this case, Sam has a psychology professor running this experiment who lives in a house with him. His name is Guy. And then we have Amy. Amy is an undergrad who discovers that this is going on and applies to get a job helping out. There's a lot of care that these animals need, of course, you know, the diaper changing, the feeding, the cleaning the crap off the walls. And as this went on, they became very attached. And she began to also work on language with him. Here's the sad fact of all these experiments, though. A chimp, as I'm sure everyone listening is aware, is a wild animal, and it's extremely powerful, much more powerful than any two men combined. Our dogs and cats have gone through thousands of generations that we've bred them, and for most part, we've got the bad apples out of there. But the chimps are coming straight out of the jungle, or in this case, from a breeding lab, which is one step removed from the jungle. They're very bright as a 3.5-year-old child. And we have one who's 2 running around the house right now. And I'll tell you, that's pretty bright. They're very independent. They don't want to be schooled or told what to do. And as they become adolescents, they become too powerful and dangerous to work with. All the chimps you see in the movies and so on, these are, for the most part, juveniles. Once they get to a certain stage, they're uncontrollable. Can you blame them? I don't blame them. And so the experiments had to be curtailed. Sadly, these animals raised as human beings, pampered, were then put into biomedical labs where they were experimented on and the animal could live to be 50 years old. In the little excerpt I would like to give you from Sam's point of view, this is the first chapter where he has been removed. He doesn't know what's happened to him. He was sedated, and he winds up in this chimp breeding facility. He doesn't even know what chimps are, and he's completely bewildered. And he's stuck in this place, and he's falling back on the language that he's learned to try to find out what is going on here. So, this is called Key, Lock, Out. He didn't have a word for words, or not yet anyway, but he knew words all the same. He knew key, he knew lock, he knew out. He was a prisoner, though he didn't have a word for that either, and even if he did, it would have been meaningless. What did a word, any word, have to do with this situation, in this place, in the onrushing, unstoppable cataract of now, and the fear, afraid, that came with it? He had diarrhea, which existed as a pain in the gut, a stench, a hot, wet squirt of shit that needed no terminology and no afterthought. He wanted his blanket, a blanket, any blanket. He was cold. He was distraught. He rocked from side to side. He stared at nothing. He plucked the hairs from his arms, his chin, the crown of his head, trichotillomania, and he didn't know that term either. How could he? And what would it matter if he did? Would that get him out of here? Sleep was his only release, and it came to him in a blaze of shuffled images. The bathroom light so bright it was like the sun in the sky, a trickle of blood-warm water in the tub, and the face of the one who meant most to him, whose name he'd invented in the gesture of pinching his right nipple the way he pinched hers when she was with him in the bed, and they were both warm, and his shirt was on the floor. But then he woke. He always woke. He woke to the screams and the reek and his own diarrhea and the food he refused and the din of flesh pounding on metal. When he was thirsty, thirst came to him as a sensation, pre-verbal, non-verbal, and he picked up his cup and drained it. He didn't think drink. He didn't sign drink. He just drank. Until the cup was empty, that is, and no one came to fill it for him. Then the word was there, and the sign, the gesture, thumb to the lower lip, descriptor and request both. And when no one listened, when the cup went unfilled and the box, the cage, the prison he measured over and over with the length and breadth of his body spoke despair to him, spoke rage, he screamed. He screamed. He screamed. In the morning, that was no morning at all because there were no windows in this place, and the lights never dimmed or faltered. They came with food for him, food he didn't want, food he refused. And he compacted his own shit in his hands as best he could and flung it through the bars at them. They didn't like that. They backed away, cursing in their alien voices. And he held one hand under his chin and waggled his fingers, cursing back at them. Dirty, dirty. That didn't help. Nothing helped. He worked at the bars with his hands and his feet too, but the bars were cold. The bars were unmovable. And every time he looked up, he saw more bars and barren walls and moving shadows till he shrank down inside himself. What had he done? Where was he? Where was his bedroom? Where was his house and his bed and his tree? Where was she? And why had she allowed them to bring him here? He took it as long as he could, huddled in the back of his cell, the box, the cage, and then leapt to his feet, clung to the bars and screamed again until the big man came through the door and every voice in the place fell silent. It was as if there had never been a voice except his, echoing down the corridors and reverberating off the bare walls. But of course, he didn't know that word either. The acoustic signifier, only the phenomenon it represented, the physical effect that involved eardrums and cochlea and neural pathways. The big man was coming, and he had the stinger in his hand, which was called a cow prod, though that formulation was behind him too. Hurt, he knew that. And he knew cow, the big lumbering night black creature that solidified the shadows in the scrub out back of her house, of his house, the place he used to be before this. But that didn't do him any good because the big man with one eye, with the black eye patch that was like a hole drilled in his head, rose and swelled and touched him with the stinger. And suddenly he was writhing on the cold cement floor, beyond the reach of words now, except hurt, except afraid. So there we have Sam's point of view in a moment of duress.
That was beautiful. Thank you so much. One of the things I really loved about the voice you create with Sam is that it's kind of impressionistic and direct and simple in a way that we imagine less linguistically developed minds are, right? Like a baby, or in this case, an animal. They don't have the language that we have, which is why I think your choice to do like a close third is a really interesting one. Can you just talk to me about how you came about developing this voice and how it differed from your usual style?
I can't count back exactly, but I would think that most of my novels, maybe 2/3 or maybe even 3/4, are in third person. This enables the novelist to step outside the story and paint the picture. First person is more limiting, but also sometimes more direct. And I have done first person accounts as well. In the Terranauts, for instance, there are 3 first person narrators. Um, I'd never written from the point of view of another species before, uh, but I wrote a novella called Wild Child some years ago, and this is about the enfant sauvage from the south of France, who was Napoleonic era, who was discovered uh, running wild in the woods. He was 11 years old. The theory is that someone had abandoned him as an infant and he somehow survived, and so he had no language. This was a very interesting concept for me. And so I wrote from his point of view. But since he had no words, and Sam does, there is a difference in the narration. Sam is able to formulate things, whereas with the wild child, l'enfant sauvage, he had to be examined. I'm in his mind, but we don't have as much language as Sam has. So I guess I had experimented with this before.
That's interesting. Because it is a balancing act, right? Of keeping the narration clear and understandable for the audience without being just a total stream of consciousness, right? While still capturing someone that doesn't have as nuanced of or sophisticated of language as you or I or human beings.
Yes, and it's a way to wonder about the value of language and the power of language. One problem with these experiments, from my point of view anyway, is that they're so species centric. We want them to talk our language. But of course, the chimps have their own language, which is primarily body language, primarily gestural, although they make many vocalizations as well. They evolved to be perfectly suited to their own community and their own environment. Unfortunately, another species came along and destroyed their environment, put them in cages, sat them in school chairs like children, and tried to make them uh, speak in sign language. And to a degree, it succeeded, of course, because they're very smart.
That's interesting. Even in Talk to Me, a lot of the communication between the human characters is nonverbal, right? Amy is not the most emotionally expressive or communicative character. And it's actually something you kind of touch on in Outside Looking In, too, in terms of Leary's, that book's about Leary's LSD experiments in the early 60s, about how language is actually kind of insufficient in some ways, our version of language, verbal language. So what does that mean for you as a writer? Like, how do you tackle or overcome that?
Absolutely, Mark. I love your connection too to Outside Looking In, my last novel, which is about human consciousness, which then led me to wonder about animal consciousness and how it is different from ours and how it's also similar. I guess other writers have written on this topic. Of course, we're fascinated by it, maybe more so than people in other professions even, because we work through words and try to get our version of the world into words on the page. I never know exactly what a story will be. Words talk to me, sentences form. I get into that place where my conscious mind is primarily shut down and follow the narrative and follow the characters through their vision of the world. And in so doing, try to figure out why I'm telling the story and what the story means and what it has to say about our lives. And in this case, of course, it has to talk about um, uh, the value of language and how we construct the world in language. And what if we didn't have the adequate language? We still have the emotional response and our five senses to interpret the world for us. But we then can't do what we're doing now. Uh, Rationalize it, talk about it, explore it verbally. This also reminds me of my 2006 novel, Talk, which is about identity theft, but the person whose identity is stolen is Dana Holter, who is a very strong willed deaf woman. So I got to talk about, from her perspective, deaf society, which uses a gestural language, and how that might have affected her dealings with the hearing world.
Yeah, I think the power of literature as an art form, in a way, is how these words as a whole can capture something. Like in your excerpt from Sam's point of view, it's a very empathetic portrayal that allows us to kind of experience what it's like to be him in a way that just direct rational communication, like representational words, don't allow on the surface.
Well, I don't know about that exactly. I mean, there are three other main points of view from regular human beings in this book. And the same thing I'm doing with Sam, I'm doing with them. But of course, they can form the sentences and they do know the words. They're not limited in the way they express themselves as he is. So he stands in contrast to them, I suppose.
So kind of going a bit of a different direction. Some authors refer to themselves as character-driven, some as plot-driven. Always found myself most interested in theme, and I find that to be a driving engine through much of your work. Is that something that you approach your writing process with first, or what guides you when you're inventing stories?
It's all a matter of evolution. And don't forget, I equally write short stories so that I can try things out in short form. I'm coming out with a new book of stories next year, so I've written 200 stories now, and I've tried every kind of experiment in every possible way along the line. I think if I look back, my early stories, Descent of Man, for instance, were much more interested in idea and aesthetics, style, the mode of telling, than in character. But as I began to write novels, I began to get more deeply into character and character-driven stories, and have even written in straightforward realism. For instance, in San Miguel of a couple of years ago, or in some of the short stories as well. I think it's got to be a balance between the three elements to make a really great story. But I think I'll agree with you. Something thematic drives me. And then a story starts and the characters fall into place. And again, you can trace back of my books. I've been writing about the environment and our place in it for a long, long time now. In fact, if I look back, I would say it's my primary theme. I'm trying to figure out who we are and what we're doing here, how we can be animals and yet be having this conversation. So I keep writing about these things and wondering about them over and over. If I should find a solution to all this, I'll let you know.
it also kind of places us as just another animal in this grand environment, right? Even with the rational language that we use, we're just another species that's kind of screwing things up in many ways.
Of course, this folds neatly into the environmentalism. I wrote A Friend to the Earth in the year 2000, projecting to 2026 with regard to pandemics and global warming and so on. Yes, I do love our species, especially the women. But yeah, it's incontrovertible that we are in a kind of death spiral at this point. In fact, I'm writing a novel now called Blue Skies. I'm 2/3 of the way through. And it is not a sequel to A Friend of the Earth, but it's starting now and projecting into the near future, uh, given what we're experiencing now with climate change, especially.
I was actually going to save this question for last, but since it's coming up, your work has been kind of eerily prescient in its dark comic takes on American society and the environment, especially after the last 2 years, and in relation to your story After the Plague, what seemed to be kind of a dystopian sci-fi apocalyptic story when I first read it.
And very funny.
Yeah, right? I guess it does prompt a kind of larger question of where do you see things going forward in the world? Is there hope? You mentioned women. I think in Talk to Me, Amy is this really great maternal, warm presence. Do you think there's a future, maybe a matriarchal future, where, or are we doomed to climate destruction?
Broad. Mark, I was just making a joke. And furthermore, I like men too, and I love babies and dogs. And if I were there, I would keep all the babies and all the dogs. This is a difficult question. I think people are interested. They can read my work. I wish I had better news for everybody. I'm trying to work through it. Here we are. We're alive. We still live in a democracy, even though we came damn close to living in a dictatorship. The coronavirus, if it weren't for the anti-vaxxers, who are its best friend, is pretty much in our rearview mirror, and I hope that we'll conquer that soon. We now have a president who will address global warming. I think we're hanging from the cliff by our fingernails, but maybe somehow things will improve. I wouldn't count on it. I have to make a comedy of all of this stuff. And you see me here making jokes and writing books and living a full and good life. But on the other hand, inside, I'm as black as a charcoal briquette.
Very, very true. I do think there's hope in art, right? We take solace in your books, and I'm also curious. There's a 2002 movie called Human Nature, written by Charlie Kaufman. I wasn't sure if you had seen it, but it shares a similar kind of plot, interspecies love triangle between a chimp, a woman, and a male scientist, and themes about nature of man, animal, and what it means to be civilized. I was wondering if that was any inspiration, if you had seen it.
I haven't seen that, although I do love some of Charlie Kaufman's work, absolutely. And other writers, as I said earlier, have taken on this subject because it is so fascinating to us who work with words all the time.
Yeah. We'll definitely check it out. I think now that you've finished the book, I know it's always difficult when you're working on it, but
because you don't want other influences to creep in. And further, I have a difficult time reading novels when I'm writing a novel. So I have some novels coming out from friends that I'd like to read, and I've been rereading old stuff just for the pleasure of it, but I don't want somebody else's words to creep in. Once I'm done with Blue Skies, which I hope will be in the next 6 months or so, then I'll go into a short story phase, and I can read every novel and everything I want, because you're not locked in the way you are with a novel. You must maintain the tone and vision over a period of a year or more. Whereas with a story, it's only a couple of weeks. And if somebody else's voice should creep in there, it really doesn't matter as long as it's germane to and fits within a given story.
So conversely, do you read short fiction while you're working on novels, or do you read nonfiction?
I would say choice B primarily. And also, in the middle of any novel where I am now, you do get bogged down. You get exhausted. The joy of the idea and the beginning now begins to unravel, because now you have to figure out where it's going and who these characters are and what the themes are and why you're writing them. So it becomes difficult. And you push to get through, and maybe it flattens your prose a bit. So I like to read Faulkner. I like to reread Faulkner at a time like this to remind me what a real rant is, and to charge up my my prose.
It's another classic English high school influence for us all, I think.
Yeah, I'm not reading as I lay dying, though. I'm reading, my favorite Faulkner is Light in August, and closely followed by a book that he didn't care for very much.
What was your research process like in terms of looking back at the histories of chimps like Nim and Coco?
I got most of the great detail from books like the Hess book, which we've mentioned. And this one is really heartbreaking too. It's Roger Fouts' Next of Kin, about Washoe and the experiments with her. They are fascinating, and they allowed me to have the details of what these experiments were about. I also have a friend who's a primatologist, and she introduced me to one of her former students who is doing a study of the chimp colony at the LA Zoo. And I was able to speak with her and observe the chimps and have her point some things out to me. But essentially, this book is coming from the research itself. And by the way, it's a good thing, because I was writing most of the book I was writing during the lockdown, when we couldn't go anywhere, even if we wanted to. And the one I've begun now, there are certain places I must see. So I'm writing ahead anyway and fudging that and hoping that once things relent a bit and we can travel again, that I can fill in the blanks if there are blanks. And I'm fairly confident in creating a scenario so that, for instance, when I wrote East is East back in 1990, which has a Japanese protagonist, I did have to write some scenes in Japan before I'd ever been there. And I was about halfway done when I got there. And it was enormously fulfilling and intriguing, and I loved the culture. But it didn't have to change much. It seemed to me that I got it kind of right.
Oh, interesting.
There, by the way, in the book I'm writing now, there is a legal scene, a court scene, and I have a close friend who has advised me for many, many years whenever I need court stuff. She's a wonderful lawyer, and just today, just before I came on the air, I had finished the one chapter that has the legal stuff. And she had already helped me a little bit with terminology and the procedure and events and so on. And she shot me back an email to say that it sounds pretty good to her. There's nothing glaringly wrong. So that made me very happy. And now I can move on.
Wow. Well, I just saw the notice. I know we're going to be moving to the audience Q&A soon. So if anyone wants to ask a question through there, I don't know if Rira wants to come back in and help guide us through that. I know some questions have already been asked.
Yeah, sure. Let me just jump back on the mic. Okay, so we have a couple of questions here. I'm just going to run through them. This question is from Becky. I so enjoy you performing your books on Audible. I noticed you didn't perform this book. What makes you perform or not perform a book?
Lately, over the last 10 years or so, I find that I don't have the energy to do an entire novel in the studio. It's tremendously difficult in that it requires tremendous focus. So if I'm giving a live show and you flub a word or so, it doesn't really matter. There's the drama of the moment. But in the studio, the engineer comes on and says, well, you got to do that again, and you do it again, and you do it again, and finally you lose control and you go completely mad. So I've just in the last years I've just done the stories themselves. Although you can dig around and find several of the novels that I've narrated too. I love doing it. With the last book of stories, the Relive Box, the studio is right down here in Santa Barbara. I know Dom Camardella, who runs it very well. We have done many, many things together, including all the New Yorker stories. Whenever the New Yorker has a story, I go to the studio and perform it for them. And the last time, the first day, I started out pretty well, and then I started to flub things around lunch, and I made a huge mistake of going out to lunch. And by the way, the recording equipment is so sensitive, it picks up the grumbling of your stomach, so you have to stop at that point. Big mistake, because after lunch, you feel like going to sleep. And I was a wreck, and I kept fumbling over the lines and so on. Then and it took 3.5 days. So the next day, I skipped lunch. I just got a Diet Coke and some peanut M&Ms, walked around the block 3 times, and came back and fired it off. But it is difficult. It requires a lot of focus and concentration. And I don't say that I will never do a novel again. Maybe I will.
Sounds like a fun experience. Yeah, we don't really hear that much about what it's like to record your own book.
Yeah,
Vera,
it is a unique kind of experience, because if you're performing in public, you hear people, you're performing for people. When you're performing in the studio, you're performing just for yourself. And it's often in a booth, and the engineer is out there, and just a voice that will come in and interrupt you once in a while. And it's curiously moving in some way to be performing for yourself. The kind of heartbreaking passages and stuff that I find moving, sometimes I'm more moved when I'm just reading it in the studio than when I'm on stage doing it.
Wow, that's really fascinating. Yeah, I'm going to move on to the next question. It's from Connor. What motivates you to write? And I'm going to expand on that and ask, what has motivated you to write during this pandemic? How did you keep your focus?
Yeah, I lost your audio there for a minute, but what motivates me to write is it's a way of trying to make sense of the senseless. Again, we are lost. We are lost. We don't know who we are. We are animals who can talk. What does it mean? Why are we here? Why do I have to die? Why is the planet dying? All of this stuff. It gives me a way of getting out of myself, getting out of my own conscious mind. It's what we only to why books, which enable the reader not only to get out of him or herself, but to recreate, film the movie of the book in his or her own mind. This is essential to me. I've been doing it all of my adult life. And if I'm not actually actively writing something, if I'm researching, for instance, I don't feel right. I need to do this to try to get control over a world that is completely out of control. Further, there is a joy in making art. So I am committed to the short story, even though most authors give up on stories because nobody wants them and they don't make any money. I don't care about that. I am just fascinated by stories, so that a story will begin and I'll try to see where it's going to go, and then it starts to go, and it might take me 2 weeks or 3 weeks. And when I get toward the end, it's true of the novel too, but with the story, it happens more often. It is so exhilarating. It's like nothing I can imagine. The joy of seeing a work of art come together. I wrote about this in my essay, This Monkey, My Back, in which I liken this to a drug experience and a drug high. And in the essay, it's like, I point out, it's like heroin. You shoot up and you have this amazing exhilaration and you feel great. But then, of course, it wears off and you need to do it again and again and again.
Tom, do you think there's dangers to that in the same way that there would be with a drug?
Yes, of course. You eventually will lose your powers, as you will lose everything.
Mm.
And if your life is one thing only, then you're in deep trouble. But of course, I've made it this far, so I don't think it really matters that much anymore.
Okay, so this question is from Nikos. Could you address the role of ecology in your perception and depiction of the joys, quirks, absurdities, and pains of the human condition?
We talked earlier about my love of nature. And by the way, you mentioned the prizes that I've won. I'm so happy to win them. It's a great honor. But the Henry David Thoreau Prize in nature writing was especially touching for me because the first novelist to get it. It was always nonfiction writers, as it should be. But yes, I'm deeply invested in nature. I spend as much time as I can outside by myself. I don't want to be on a group hike or a group kayak paddle or anything else. I don't do that. I do it entirely on my own. My favorite thing, and I haven't been able to do it because of the pandemic, is to go up to this Sequoia National Forest where I've been going for many, many years, uh, uh, right up there in a little house. And once I'm done with work, I go deep into the woods by myself and just feel it. Now, I'll bring a book, of course. I might take a swim, but I'm hours and hours just feeling what's around me and experiencing it through my five senses. That's hugely important to me. And so um, I can't help writing about nature and biology. These are the things that most fascinate me.
Okay, so we have a question from Vincent. It's phrased a little bit difficultly, so let me see if I can get the gist of it. Which novels have touched you as much as your desire to touch your readers?
Wow, there are thousands of them. Um, I'll give you an example. Dennis Johnson, whom I knew a bit, we were in a writer's workshop together. Uh, his novel Fiscadoro, to me, is one of the most extraordinary and moving novels I've ever read. Each set in a post-apocalyptic Florida. We don't know what happened, but we presume it was a nuclear war. And now we're a couple of generations removed. And what is the received wisdom and the received culture? And how is a new culture generated from that? And of course, he was a brilliant lyrical writer. It just deeply touches me, and I've read it several times.
Okay, we have time for a few more questions. So, people in the audience, if you have last minute questions, now is the time to send them in. All right, this next question is from Kay. Any plans to write After the Plague, Part 2?
Well, I kind of am right now. So Blue Sky's a new novel. Again, it's set from now and moving forward. And, we're already in a pandemic. I'm trying to assess what it might be like in the coming years, given the pandemic, of course, but more so the the way global warming has come on us so quickly, and how it's apparent even to the deniers at this point. And what are we going to do about it? And does it threaten the existence of our species, which I think it does? So I am still dealing with these sorts of issues. And next year I will have my new collection, I Walk Between the Raindrops, after the New Yorker story. Uh, and it has several stories in it that deal with ecological problems, just as the Relive box did. For instance, the story Surtsey, which was about the Kivalina Island in Alaska, which is sinking and had to be evacuated. So yes, I'm always focusing on this kind of theme and hope to continue to do so.
So the answer is yes.
Yeah.
Continuous sequels. All right. Next question. Do you have a favorite opening line out of all the ones you've written for your stories?
Wow. But yes, of course. My very first book, Descent of Man, which Mark alluded to earlier, which is my first take on the ape researcher triangle, which I wrote as a student when I was in the writer's workshop in the 1970s. It opens with this line: I was living with a woman who suddenly began to stink. And why does she stink? Well, because she's intimate with her charge, this ape whom she's teaching language to. So I've come back, of course, now, all these years later, to do a full novel on this subject. But that story was wild, absurdist, crazy, funny stuff. This one is humorous. Talk to me. But I think it should deeply touch you. And in fact, there at the climax of this book, if you're not sobbing, you're probably not even alive. I certainly sobbed. Here I am sitting by my keyboard. It's still damp from writing that scene.
This question is from Honey. I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing your name. Other than nature, the environment, etc., where else do you find ideas?
Human conflict, obviously. I am the sort of writer who will try to tackle anything that interests me. And so that I may read of something that, in the paper, that somebody's done, a crime committed, or some absurdity. So, for instance, one of my favorite stories to perform in public is called The Lie. And I had read something somewhere, it might have even been an advice column, about a couple. And the guy was kind of sleazy and he was losing his job and he needed money and so on. So he told his fellow workers that his child had died. And they were very supportive and they gave him money and so on. And then he was busted and it was a fraud and so on. So these kind of interpersonal relations, of course, are the gist of all novels. And even in the environmental novels, they have to do with human conflict. And joy, and human joy too. You know, I do occasionally write stories that do not have violent, depressing endings. I would write more of them.
It's important to have a good balance of joy and introspective despair.
I take joy, as Mark said earlier, in just making the story. And I think the readers take joy in being involved in the story. The most tragic stories can be as uplifting to us in a way as pure comedy.
Yeah, I definitely agree.
I'm curious, actually, because you mentioned your early short story that tackled a similar premise and how it was more comic, satirical, that there's certainly elements of that in Talk to Me, but it's more humanistic, maybe I would say, too. Although even just using that word feels faulty, considering the story.
Let's call it chimpanzistic.
Yeah. Do you think that's a result of it being a longer work or maturity, or what do you think the change was prompted by?
Oh, both, of course. In my early works like Budding Prospects and Water Music and World's End and so on, and Greasy Lake and these stories, I had a certain fan base who loved that. And when I wrote different things and went in a different direction, would write to me and complain, why don't you write that stuff like Descent of Man anymore? Well, I do, but I write a lot of other things as well. I don't want to be repeating myself. I want to keep moving forward and writing in any mode that occurs to me. And so here, as we talked right at the beginning of this wonderful conversation, which I thank you for, Mark, I wanted the challenge of trying to narrate through the point of view of another species and examine that consciousness, which isn't so different from ours. I mean, as Jared Diamond has it, we are the third chimpanzee. It's fairly obvious. So the desires of Sam are the same as our desires.
I think that is a great place to wrap things up. Thank you to everyone who tuned in and sent in questions. Thank you, Tom. Thank you, Mark. This was such a wonderful talk. I'm so glad I was able to listen to you guys. Again, we have signed book plates available for those who are interested in buying Talk to Me. It's a beautiful cover, by the way. So if you would like a signed book plate, make sure to write signed book plate in the order comments when you're checking out your cart. And oh yes, there you go. There's the cover. And for those of you who tuned in late, don't worry. A replay of this talk will be available after the stream ends, so you'll be able to catch the beginning of it. I think that about does it. Thank you so much, Tom, for taking the time to speak with us. And stay safe, everyone.
Thank you, Vera, and thanks, Mark. It's tremendous fun. Next time we do it live.
Yes.
I hope so.
It's a date. All right. Have a good weekend, everyone. All right.